when someone is in a stressful moment, we were talking about crisis earlier, when someone's in a
Mm,
stressful moment and their approach by someone who is being empathetic and compassionate,
mhm.
that leaves an indelible mark that then they can choose to use that as like a coping mechanism or a new approach the next time that happens. And I know I talked about this earlier, but that attitude of gratitude, it's infectious. Empathy and compassion, believe inherently are infectious. It's like when society projects that those are qualities that are less than or only for certain genders or puts different stipulations on them, people then close off and shut down. But I think if you can cultivate it and you can inspire it and it's like wildfire. If it's cultivated, you're gonna get more of it.
Hi, I'm Elena.
And I'm Marissa.
Thanks for joining us.
Let's dive into another exciting episode of Everything is Learning. Hi, Lane. How are
Hey,
you?
great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to come back and talk today. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, specifically the grit and resilience pieces, which require the vulnerability and reflection. Because recently, I had a crisis. I had to take one of my children to the ER,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
and that was really scary because he's so little and he can't tell me what's wrong.
Yeah.
And the emergency room didn't do anything. Like unfortunately, it was really late at night, and so by the time we finally got seen after waiting 2 hours, he was very sleepy, and a lot of the problems that resulted in us going, he wasn't demonstrating. But I was so
Mm,
frustrated because I left not having a solution to the problem. The next morning, he wakes up in the same level of pain and discomfort, and it was so frustrating, and I wasn't going back, and I knew I wouldn't have been level-headed or understanding, so we went to urgent care. So
okay.
I was vulnerable and a bit emotional with the doctor in a respectful manner because I needed answers. And
Yeah.
leveling with him had helped. I was able to take some of the core concepts that we had discussed in previous episodes to
Oh, cool.
answer and get the solution I was looking for. But the doctor was super empathetic and compassionate, actively listening to my concerns while I was an advocate for my child because he can't speak and he can't tell me what's wrong. And I'm going just based on body language and the fact that he is so unlike himself. So
Right.
I was able to approach that situation and be vulnerable and reflect on things that had been happening. And so the doctor really inspired me because of how empathetic and compassionate he was being. So
Mm.
given knowing that I was coming into this conversation, I wanted to ask you, who inspires you to be gritty, compassionate, or empathetic?
Yeah. Well, first off, shout out to that doctor because I think a lot of the issues right now in healthcare, particularly in the United States, and the frustrations that people are having is just, and even outside of healthcare, people don't feel seen, heard. There's not. I feel like the reason that we're talking about empathy and compassion today is because we need so much more of it. And like
Yes.
right now in my head, Imagine by John Lennon is playing. And I'm
Well,
just
Dr.
like,
Matt is my hero because like you said, he heard me. I felt like I had finally gotten some solutions because that is, to your point, not the experience of many people recently.
right.
Everybody is at their wits' end and totally strapped and tired.
Right. And I think the other thing too though is like you were an advocate. And I think that there are still so many people. I would even probably say the majority of human beings are not advocates for themselves. And are more
Mhm.
so advocates for others. And I think in that situation, as much as you were advocating for my sweet little nephew, you were also advocating for you because you were feeling like this was an out of control situation. You know your child
Yeah.
and you knew that something was wrong. And I think you also being vulnerable was a sense of like you having self compassion, which is
Mm.
something I hope we can talk about a little bit today too. And so, like, I'm inspired by you. I'm inspired by Dr. Matt. Shout out again to Dr. Matt. But
Mm.
I also I think to answer your question, I'm really inspired by like anyone and everyone and like everything. And I think when people say inspired, they think it has to be a positive, but I think of inspiration as a mindset almost. Like if I see someone being cruel to someone else, it inspires me to be kind. Does that make sense? So
That's
I think,
nice. Yeah, like
which,
bullies on
but
a
it's
playground,
true.
right?
Yeah, like or even like in a grocery store when a parent is feeling frustrated or someone is feeling frustrated and they are not their best selves. Like in that moment, I feel like there is a call for compassion and empathy, so it inspires me to be that person for whoever was on the receiving end of someone's pain, really. And
That's
that
so
person is
nice.
certainly responsible. No, but it's true. Like it really is true. Like when somebody's going through something, don't you want to be helpful? You don't just leave them there, do you?
Well, no,
Marissa, I know you
but
don't.
I
Well,
I guess I get so I guess I get so self-consumed and self-involved that I might be missing out on those opportunities, but, like, I definitely
mm,
can appreciate, like, the the better part of me wants to leave things better than, I might have found it. So I definitely can appreciate that. And, everybody wants a win. And like having
mm,
been on the receiving end when someone's noticed I'm having a tough moment and how good
mhm,
that's made me feel, like it's this attitude of gratitude or the desire to give back and how contagious that can be, like that whole pay it forward mentality with the
right.
empathy and the compassion and all of that. But I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little hard pressed to think about the last time I did it. I mean, like, around this time of year, I guess maybe I should say in the holiday season, a lot of people do this in like lines at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts where they pay for the person behind
Behind
them
the
and things like that. But I think I'd rather do that more intentionally. And this is like inviting me to try and find opportunities when that can be true because I don't know, sometimes I'm just too self-involved. So I need to be a little bit more empathetic and compassionate and find those opportunities. But I love that you do that. So, but getting back to my question, that's
yeah.
nice that you said me. Who else do
Yeah,
you find as empathetic and compassionate and gritty?
sure. Yeah, yeah. I think for me, two people who like people should know. And I say should, and I don't usually project that on people, but I really feel like a lot of people will know these people. But the two people who came first to my mind were Nelson Mandela and Michael J. Fox. Um,
Ooh,
and I think a lot of
tough. Good
people,
ones.
I think people historically should know Nelson Mandela, but I mean, his quotes just continue to live on and his spirit and everything. I think it's amazing. But Michael J. Fox, I think a lot of people would know him as the advocate he is today, as opposed to also like the actor. Um, I just, I think these are two people, and I actually, Maya Angelou is another one who I'm extremely inspired by. Like, these are
Okay, yes.
people who took their pain. I have a deep respect for people who take their pain and their learnings and turn it into good to help others, especially when it empowers
Yeah,
people. And
good point.
I see the grit. It's almost like like you go through a moment, and not everybody has to go through pain to be this way, to be gritty, to be compassionate or empathetic. But I do think people who are deeply gritty, compassionate, empathetic, um, and passionate about something typically went through some kind of negative experience and then chose to
Sure.
persevere. And like we've talked about, like grit takes practice. And I just deeply admire
Yes.
those people from where the struggles that were presented to them, the way they were treated, and then how they became grittier. And then from that grit, they found something they were passionate about, and they were empathetic towards the people who were also dealing with those things and became a voice of good. But they were also extremely honest about their struggles, and they were, some of them, very vulnerable people. And I think that's
Yeah,
the
like
other piece.
humanness.
Yes, and I think that that piece for me is also really important for how I find inspiration in others, but I was also thinking about like who could I intentionally call out for being those things to my 2-year-olds, my 5-month-old probably not. I mean, but to my 2-year-olds at the very least, or my nephews, your kids. And I was thinking about Judy Hopps from Zootopia. Like
Yes! Oh,
our
that's
kids
such a
love,
good one!
but like look at, so here's why though. Cuz I always need a why, and you know this about me. But the reason that I chose Judy Hopps was not because she was this like bunny who thought outside of the box and wanted to be more. I actually, there's a moment in the movie where she is at the ice cream shop and Nick is standing there with the fake baby and
Oh, yeah.
like
Mhm.
and asking for this like popsicle in this elephant store, and you see her moment of racism. Do you remember
Mm.
that moment where she looks and
Yes.
she's like, "Oh,
She,
it's
like,
a
reaches.
fox." Yeah,
Yes,
for
yes.
the fox spray,
Yeah.
and because of what her family has told her, and I find that moment so incredibly powerful because I don't think everybody who is gritty, who is compassionate, who is empathetic always was. I think children
That's
grow
a good
up that
point.
I think children are that way. I think that they are inherently that way when they're younger. I think society infiltrates and makes them question themselves and doesn't foster correctly. But I do believe in moments like that that are presented, particularly like shout out to all the makers who do those kind of animation type stories to teach
Yeah.
children. But it makes parents think too. It makes adults think too. And I noticed that moment, and for that, I I think she was already a compassionate person and an empathetic person. You see that when she's very young. But at
Sure.
that point, she didn't have any kind of racial tendencies. She didn't like, she knew that
Was, like,
Gideon Gray was
speciest, not
small-minded.
even yeah,
Right.
right.
So she called that out, but she got those tickets back, and then as she grew up, she
Yeah.
started to check her like, I guess it's racism, right? Or exclusivity,
Yeah, or
like of some kind? Species,
speciest. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
speciest. Let's go with that. So that was one that I thought of, like, and at the end where she kind of like changes the culture because of her vulnerability, because of her being gritty and
Yeah.
compassionate and empathetic and and her passion. I think that she's a great example. Another one, I just dressed up as Marlin from Finding Nemo for Halloween,
Oh,
like when we did our
yeah.
family theme and stuff. And it's
Yeah.
another evolution character where, gosh, he is so like obnoxious to me and small minded. And it's because of a trauma that he went through, losing not only his wife, but
I
also
know. Ugh.
his like babies. And
Yeah.
then Nemo obviously has the fin issue, and like his dad sees it as a complex for him, but Nemo doesn't. And
Yeah, it's
so
like a
Nemo's,
projection. Yeah.
yes, and Nemo is constantly getting that, and it's out of protection. But that's an excuse for behavior that I don't condone. And what I think this movie was about was more about Marlin's evolution than it ever really was about Nemo. I really do.
That's so
And
interesting. That's a good
uh,
take.
well, thanks, hot take. But like, I think throughout that journey, first off, he meets Dory, who is not neurotypical, right? We can tell that she also has been through like a traumatic brain injury, which we end up finding out in Finding Dory, the extent of it, but the extent of it. But so he then has to learn patience. He
Yeah.
has to learn grit because of all of the things that they go through, and
Yeah.
he's learning more how to be vulnerable, and he's vulnerable with Dory, and that eventually leads him to finding Nemo. And I think he also, we're going to get a little deep here, finds himself. um and I
Well,
think
yeah,
he,
he has to do things outside of his normal, like, you
comfort
have to put
zone,
trust in another. Yes, exactly, which is
right?
learning, like, that's yes,
And I
where it
think
becomes a
another
learning
piece
mentor
of
for him.
it, yeah, like, and I think what we see is just like we've talked about hundreds of times before. The more vulnerable you are, the more you understand. I think he had compassion for Dory over time. I think it was
Yes.
initially an annoyance and then it became something that he understood more because he spent more time with someone who was unlike him. I
Yes.
think he was very lonely and he created that space for himself. And I thought about Crush too and how annoying he how annoyed he was with Crush and like his California dude attitude like kind of thing. Do you remember Crush the big turtle?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like and he's just like calm in nature and they were so the opposite of each other and Crush was so sure of himself. I am seriously projecting here, but like seemed so sure of himself that he wasn't bothered by Marlin being like I have to get here, I have to do this, I have to do that. And then you get to
Yes.
see the little
Correct.
baby turtles and how they are like Crush, even though they're a little bit more like high strung and energetic. And that's because Crush is a learning mentor who teaches them passion, compassion, grit, vulnerability. And it is truly second nature to them. And then eventually Marlin becomes friends with someone who is totally opposite. So I think that I'm inspired by Marlin because of the evolution and because I think there is always opportunity for limitless transformation. Sorry, this was very long winded.
I agree with everything you said. And I think it's super profound. A couple of things. So I know each of the examples you gave, and each of those people or characters are unique. They don't have the same story, they don't have the same background. I think another super powerful thing to take away is that, like Judy, with moments of curiosity and creativity, she was able to use societal, like per Zootopia, societal norms to kind of twist and bend it to like how she needed it. So you were talking about how she is not necessarily unconventional or out of the box, but she uses the parameters given to
Mm,
help the situation and turn that into a learning experience and like still get the outcome that she wanted. So that was like the cleverness and uniqueness there. The other thing is all of those people who either encountered pain or who had some kind of challenge presented to them, they didn't perpetuate that issue. They chose to rise above it, requiring the vulnerability, the compassion, the grittiness. Like, because I mean, if you look at some of our world wars and global history, there are people who experience the trauma and then take and project that trauma. Racism is a perfect example of that because we had talked about this at in the Zootopia context, people who were perpetrated against continue that cycle and then we never break free. So it
mm,
requires somebody transcending their experience, being vulnerable, being compassionate, self accepting, and recognizing that they want to leave something better
mhm.
and then moving forward and changing that for let's go with society because Nelson Mandela did it, Maya Angelou did it. Like she, those people did better for other people. Michael J. Fox is doing that, especially from a medical perspective. So I love all of those examples. Their passions are distinct from mine, but their experiences of grit are relatable and aspirational. And
Mm,
it wasn't because of one thing they did. They developed grit over an accumulation of each step, being brave, taking risks, learning from mistakes because I'm sure they weren't 100% successful all the time. They
right,
were motivated, they stayed consistent, and all the other things we have discussed. And I can empathize with the many challenges of the characters and the people that you named as far as what drove them to develop their grittiness. Because even though I haven't necessarily experienced any of those things acutely,
right,
it's all relatable because of how they applied it.
right, right. Yeah. I also think that it's really interesting too because I don't know that in those situations anyone intentionally goes out of their way to do something. I think I saw some video recently about how um one of the most natural human expressions is art and
Oh,
like the example was actually you know what it was Ethan Hawke, that's who it was, the actor. He was being interviewed about his concern over art dying because of artificial intelligence in something else. And what he talked
oh,
about was as artificial intelligence rises, we need more empathy, compassion, and we also need, and actually, he may not use those words, but that's what I took away from it. And he talked about how art is essential. He's like, we will always have, for instance, grief. And he talked about like when we lose someone, what is the first thing, one of the first things that people do?
Cry.
Cry. And then what do you search for in terms of like getting out of that moment?
Probably like happy memories of them, or like um support. Like,
Right. So, and some people don't know how to ask for it because typically when you're in grief, there's like a onslaught of people who once they find out want to help and stuff. But one of the first things that people typically do, which is true of me at least, is I go to a song and I want to like hear a song that
oh,
brings me
got it.
comfort, right? Or I want to
Okay.
find a poem about grief, or I want to write about it or journal about it, or make a picture about it or somehow express my pain. And typically it's through art, whether you're making it or someone else has made it for you, and you're trying to find connection in something. So, to his point,
Sure.
he's saying, art is so valuable and it helps the artist to empathize with the person who's going through something and vice versa. So, he talks about how in the age that we're in, empathy is important and that art is what helps us to empathize and connect with one another. And I just thought that that was such an interesting perspective that I don't think people intentionally think about, if that makes sense.
Well, and to your point, or Ethan Hawke's point, artificial intelligence isn't, even though there's intelligence implied, I don't think empathy and compassion really can come from something that I think is so cold and impassioned. Like that, the whole point of it is rationality and like drawing conclusions from learning, which is great, but not what you need in moments of grief or what I would think about from moments of art. That said, there was a painting of Alan Turing that artificial intelligence did that sold for $1 million at Sotheby's. So I
Mm.
hear you on artificial intelligence and art, but with that said, to your point, and now reflecting, like when I go through grief, I think my gut reaction is here's what I think other people need, but what do I actually do? Well, cry is true, but I probably become apathetic. Like I internalize, and so empathy really helps break through apathy. Um
Yes,
because
yes.
like the depressive state, and but like a tie-in to that person to keep their memory alive, that is absolutely something that I would do. And whether that be photographs of that person, play by play memories of that person, something
Mhm.
that reminds me of that person, it would tend to show up in art. So whether that's
Yeah, like
music, those,
storytelling,
yes, right,
photography, right, and I
yes,
the other end of the spectrum he talked about too is, like, when humans express a strong emotion, like, he talked about joy too, like, when you're super happy, like, what do you do? Like, some people, especially in today's age, they typically wanna share it, right? And you talked about photography, so, like, you share a photo or you share something else, and here's the thing I think about technology. I think in social media, there are a lot of negatives, but I also think that we are humans who need connection. What I think is lacking is the compassion and the empathy. And I think we saw that particularly with this election. And I'm not going to get super political, but I think
yeah,
on both sides, people were not thinking about our youth and the impact that people's messages after the results of the election had on children. I don't think that they were thought of. And I think that the lack of impact and empathy and forethought on how someone's reaction could be for future voters. I mean, some of the things that were online, it was really impactful in talking with learners after the results who were not young enough to vote. A lot of them were like, why would I bother voting? Why would I bother voting if it's going to create so many issues? And that to me is so hard. And I hope that people will think of how to be empathetic for those children. And I'm hoping that people will be more intentional. moving forward about
Sure.
what is said and what is expressed, because we are all in a position, if we are older, almost all of us are in a position where a younger person is going to take in our words, our impact, our modeling, and they're going to see that, and they're going to make decisions based off of that. And in typical situations, you'll model it, or they'll model it. They'll model whatever it is. So, I don't know, it's just another connection to all of this, I think.
Well, at some point in time in the upcoming elections or whatnot, those young people will be part of the critical demographic that the
Right.
politicians will be speaking toward. So hopefully they'll be more mindful of those contributions. But right now, the young people, I mean, 18 I still think is very young, but under 18 isn't they can't elect those people. So their critical issues aren't top of the ballot issues.
Right.
Politicians are speaking to their demographics. With that said, I'm really excited knowing that the future generations, I, I would hate to think that they opt not to vote because of the apathy that they're experiencing now, but that
Right.
when the time comes, they will choose to use
Their
vulnerability,
voice.
compassion, empathy, grittiness, whatever their purpose in life or their drive, to use that toward how they decide who should be an elected official. And
Right.
as much as I think the federal government election does impact our daily life, the community ones, those are the ones that frequently, because of how every year those people are voted on. I would love to see young people go and show up in the same droves and numbers for those voting as we do the federal elections, because that's really the at home contributions. They're the people that you really need to get invested in because they make the biggest difference. However, you choose to vote, that's where it's really going to feel personal. And I hope
Right.
that's where they start making those changes. But I think like also the fact that you have a plethora of experience as a learning mentor, whether in a traditional role or not, you can speak to a lot of this and to what young people's experiences is. So I'm interested in hearing on the type of situations you found yourself in where empathy and compassion have been necessary.
Okay, yeah. Oop, I will say that, um, I have become a much more empathetic and compassionate person just myself because of having worked in educational institutions for, like, 16 plus years, and my heart always goes back to
Wow,
situations.
congrats.
Oh,
Long time.
well, you know what I'm doing now. I love what I do now from home. I love being with my children. I love doing this podcast, and I love what I do in academic and executive functioning coaching, which is outside of educational institutions. But I like that amount of time being in traditional education, I think taught me so much. And I think that's important for people to understand too, is if everything is learning and learning is everything and we are always learning, then we also are understanding that we can learn from both sides of a continuum, whether you are a classroom teacher or not. Like as an adult, we learn things as an infant, as a child. Like throughout life, we are the person taking in the knowledge at all times. It's just, are we also giving the knowledge? And I think being on both sides of the learning continuum is important. And I don't think you could be a learning mentor without learning about yourself in the process. So I'm a deeply passionate advocate for
Good
all
point.
learners. Oh, thanks. And at all ages, and I have this really deep-seated passion, most especially for learners who don't present as typical people, and I think that's where my empathy and compassion was really pressed. I've talked about this before that, it's not just because of my Italian background. I'm sure that enhances it. I used to talk at people when I felt like I was passionate about something because it was so important that people could be empathetic in those situations and really understand someone's point of view, whether it was mine or someone else's. And I realized that that is not a strength necessarily. And that has taught me a lot of empathy and compassion. And people have been compassionate towards me to help me learn. Um, but whenever someone has come to me about a learner or even their own child with a label, that to
Yeah.
me is like a trigger. And but the way that I've reframed that trigger is like, I'm always like, I 1,000% accept. Let me prove you wrong. I'm going to prove you wrong about this person. I love people, And in my own life, from my own experience, it's those learners who need to be seen and heard the most. And I think that every bit of communication, whether it's traditional or non traditional, verbal or nonverbal, I think every move or word that somebody gives is information that we should be taking in to gather to then be able to help a person. And, like I believe to the very
Yeah,
core of my being that we cannot be citizens of the world without empathy and compassion. Like,
I
I
fully
know
agree.
you know people like this, I know people like this, but people who live without empathy and compassion were somehow taught that that was a way to live. It was somehow modeled somewhere. They were hurt somewhere along their journey. And I hope if any of those people are listening, you know that you have community with us and you can unlearn that mindset and we can help. And that way of life is so not worth it because the pain that comes along with you treating yourself and treating others
Lonely.
without empathy, it's lonely. It's so dark there. And having been there myself at times throughout life, like I have horrible issues with self-compassion. I know that and I'm working on it. I feel like very compassionate and empathetic with everyone else to the nth degree, but I know that I am not necessarily there with myself. And I believe that everyone needs empathy and compassion and they need to flex those muscles.
I absolutely agree with that. And I would say, like, our parents instilled in us to leave a place better than you found it. And I believe that can be applied to people too. So,
Yeah.
the unique cases that you mentioned above, it requires compassion and meeting people where they're at, empathizing with the shared experiences that you two might have in common to build that connection, but also tapping into their interests and leveraging what might feel challenging or as an obstacle like an opportunity. It reminded me, as I was thinking about this, of a TED Talk by Josh Shipp that's titled Your Child's Most Annoying Trait May Just Reveal Their Greatest Strength. And like
Oh,
a lot of times,
that's the one
oh,
you
go
sent
sorry.
me the other day, right? It
Yeah, yeah, right.
was
And
genius.
because a lot of and in it he talks about how he was the annoying kid in class in the sense that he would talk out of turn and all of that, but that the just one learning mentor, his specific teacher at the time, saw the potential in him to use that talent that he had that could create a disruption, but to channel it into being a great debater and public speaker. And like that changed the whole trajectory of his life because one person believed in him. And I honestly, it inspires me to be your sister because I know you've done that for other people. I can think of
Aw.
dozens of examples, but in local district, uh, at least 3 people that I know you're still in contact with, and you're that person for them, which is amazing. So, a learning mentor can find the spark in a person like you have and could lead to passion or career opportunities. But it's the difference between potential behavioral problems and dissonance versus self-belief and self-acceptance because then they see this as like their superpower or their unique talent. And I would love to see more people understand that having the empathy and compassion can bring the passion out in people.
Oh, I love that. I've never that's so eloquently put. Just say it one more time because I just wanna make sure I, like, process it for, old like, forever moving forward.
That seeing being empathetic and
Mhm.
and compassionate and seeing that spark in people can bring out their passion.
Can bring out their passion. Yeah. No, I think that's so true. I think the other piece that empathy and compassion bring out is it's almost like you speak to a part of somebody that radiates their value. I think that's the
Mm,
piece. Like all of a sudden you feel seen. That's what I say to everybody. Like my job, like I feel like my calling is to see people. And when I say see, I don't mean visually. I mean like actually understand who they are as a person because people don't just take the time anymore. And I
yeah.
really think the critical roles of empathy and compassion in the learning process are what you're talking about. I feel like there should be some kind of a class before you leave middle school before you leave high school, and maybe even elementary school. I mean, I believe that almost anything can be taught at any age if it doesn't have to do with curriculum. Like anything that has to do with
Yeah.
like
Not
humanity.
standardized. Yeah,
Right, not
sure.
standardized, but I think that this should be standardized in the sense that it's reinstituted
Commonplace for
every year.
everyone.
Yes.
Yes.
Right, right, right. And I think that it should be like, this is how you see people and value people. And this is how you should feel or could feel. I don't like telling people how they should feel, but I just think that it's so critical, especially in learning, to point out empathy and compassion and teach empathy and compassion. Um, and
It's
it's
something
interesting.
hard to do. Like, I
It
feel like
is.
people have to see examples of it to understand what it is, and to your point, like, to feel seen, so you can feel when people are like that, but it's not necessarily something that you can because it's not tangible, it's difficult to teach in the sense
Right.
that or, like, impart, but modeling is a really great way to do this. But I think when someone is in a stressful moment, we were talking about crisis earlier, when someone's in a
Mm,
stressful moment and their approach or they are approached by someone who is being empathetic and compassionate,
mhm.
that leaves an indelible mark that then they can choose to use that as like a coping mechanism or a new approach the next time that happens. And I know I talked about this earlier, but that attitude of gratitude, it's infectious. Empathy and compassion believe inherently are infectious. It's like when society projects that those are qualities that are less than or only for certain genders or puts different stipulations on them, people then close off and shut down. But I think if you can cultivate it and you can inspire it and it's like wildfire.
Right.
If it's cultivated, you're going to get more of it.
I agree with you, and you know that there are certain people that I've had to have in my life who have told me that my empathy is not valued. And you know that that
Yeah,
has been really
fortunate.
challenging for me to navigate. Like, I felt like I couldn't be myself around these people, and I have to, if I am inauthentic, it presents in really challenging ways, and I go
Sure.
through this cycle where I spin where I'm like, I am just a genuinely empathetic and compassionate person, so like I'm trying to meet you where you're at, but you don't value who I am as a person, and since you don't value who I am as a person, I want to make you feel comfortable. And I am at the point in my life, especially, and I've learned through this podcast and I've learned from having these conversations and I've learned from our listeners, like, I should not be devaluing myself, especially in the places of empathy and compassion, to make
For
other
sure.
people feel comfortable. That doesn't
Well,
make any sense. So you're talking about modeling, and I think that is so valuable, because if you see somebody be empathetic or compassionate, you are more likely to be that. I agree with that.
I hear you. The other thing I was going to say related to that is being empathetic and compassionate. A lot of people think, oh, well, then, someone's going to get walked all over. That does not
Right.
mean that you shouldn't set up boundaries for your empathy and compassion because when you're constantly giving, it can be draining and you need to fill your own cup before you can help someone else.
Mhm.
What I will offer is empathy and compassion can be given to anyone, but there is still appropriate limitations to that. Like if someone, to your point,
Preach.
is making you feel like you are no longer able to be your authentic self while trying
Mm.
to be empathetic or compassionate to that person, at some point there's a limit. And setting healthy boundaries and expectations are important when exercising compassion and exercising empathy because you can be the person that everyone taps into, but you also have to be self-aware. We were talking about this earlier. You have to be
Mhm.
self-aware to know when enough is enough. And
Mhm.
I think people who are empathetic and compassionate with themselves are
Mhm.
able to do this well.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, like throughout this season, I've talked about mental health and managing stress and work life balance and boundaries. You were just talking about self worth, self care, triggers, some of the other things we've talked about, earlier in the episode too. And I think when I think about how all of this could be like a package, it's all like interwoven pieces. I think empathy and compassion are like the big bows that you make on like a gift. Like they're the things that tie
That's
this whole
cool.
season together. Well, I like visuals, but I think
Yeah,
that
sure.
I really like visuals. Um, and I think about it as like, empathy deepens our understanding of ourselves and others. That's how I like, if I were to give it a definition, I would say that's almost its purpose, to deepen our understanding of ourselves and others. I think it also allows us to see from another perspective. I
Mm,
think it gives meaning to like connections and relationships if we can have empathy with one another. And I really believe, as I've said before, it's essential for learning and growth. And I think compassion, it breaks down barriers. Like empathy is to deepen our understanding, and compassion breaks down the barriers that prevent us from building ones up. Like, I think that
interesting.
if we don't have compassion for ourselves first, we're just going to keep building up walls and barriers. And
Mm,
we can continue to create ones that don't even already exist. Like we're just going to go throughout life and we're not going to be compassionate to ourselves. And I think when someone is compassionate in a moment of struggle, let's say, it breaks down the barrier. And
sure.
I think empathy and compassion go really together quite beautifully because it creates safer environments. It prompts like being inclusivity, and it increases people's value. And I think that
That's
that's
true.
why it kind of all bounds together is, when you talk about mental health and you talk about managing stress and you talk about self-worth and self-care, like I think both just create this massive like portal door into a completely different life. And it's like, unwrap this sucker, and like you can literally change your life.
Sure.
And I think when learning mentors and learners implement empathy, it creates opportunities for growth and growth mindset. Like
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
if you go into a healthy workplace, if you go into a healthy classroom, you will
Do those
see
exist?
people.
No, I'm teasing.
Well, they do, but they are rare. And I really truly believe it has to do with it. People talk about like culture, right? Like culture within a classroom,
Yeah.
culture within a community, culture within, your work environment. And so often when you sit down and you look at the research, it has to do with creating opportunities for growth and being seen and feeling valued. And the only ways you can do that are with empathy and compassion. It builds emotional intelligence. It
Mhm.
helps us to identify our own emotions and reflect. It also uplifts others and it helps to address challenges. Like, I just think, I also think that, like, we talked about grittiness. I
Yeah.
think that,
Yes.
like you were talking about, I think it's intuitive too. I think that the more room we have for self compassion, self care, self worth, they're not bound by judgment if we see our value in ourselves and others.
That is groundbreaking. It's a lot to think about and unpack right there. I what I hear when you say those things is self-understanding, which I think is pivotal to being empathetic and compassionate because if you understand yourself, you can empathize more with others because you have a deeper understanding of self and value and all of that, and it can't
Mm,
be developed overnight. I also think it requires reflection, which I know we've talked about previously, and it's a core concept when demonstrating compassion because the act of compassion is recognizing intent and offering someone some space and grace,
oh,
potentially
yeah.
even a calm environment to process that. And I know personally, as far as my own self understanding, that empathy and compassion have come from my experience with key learning mentors in my life who've
Mm,
role modeled on my journey of self discovery, and the learning that I have gained from those encounters inform how I now act as a learning mentor for others.
right.
And I couldn't put that into words without having listened to your podcast and previous episodes and formalizing that into what I was already doing. I will say intentionally, but
Mm,
without the understanding and the meaning behind it. And I know you talk about how you don't like
mm,
labels, but in this instance, I can actually give a name to what I was already doing or to what felt natural to me. I just didn't know why I was doing it, or I didn't. It wasn't until talking through this with you that I can reflect and recognize that my intentionality is because of my previous learning experiences with vulnerability, with accountability, with consistency, with all of those things, including empathy and compassion.
Aw, I love that. Yeah, I mean, the title of the podcast kind of says it all, right? Like everything is learning, and learning really is everything. And I think if we can practice being open to those ideas and like maybe even instill it as a mindset,
Mm,
reflection is such a big key, and giving meaning and identifying purpose. I think that it can even be a mantra, like everything is learning and learning is everything. Like if you're in a weak moment or you're struggling or you're feeling really like high on a moment, I think just saying that can bring so much peace and light and focus. Like you were talking about intentionality. I do think that it's sometimes very hard in today's world to live intentionally, to live with empathy, to live with compassion. And I'm just so glad you've been here. I can't wait
thanks.
for season 3. Thank you so much for ending this with me on
Yeah,
a high
I'm
note.
excited.
Yeah, everybody tune into season 3 of Everything is Learning. We're gonna take it to the next level. We're gonna be
Woohoo!
welcoming, yeah, woo woo. We're gonna be welcoming like an incredible lineup of guest speakers, who are ready to, spark fresh ideas and share their stories and deep dive with us into the endless adventure that is learning. So
Woohoo!
don't miss it. Yeah. Thanks for being here, Mimi.
Thank you.
All right. Be well and happy learning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Everything is Learning. We're so glad you joined us.
Be sure to subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.